Jacob, I think you're full. I think you did something to this baby, and now you're trying to make up excuses as to why you don't remember.
Was your daughter real? While your wife went to work.
That you were
jobs.
That you were able to tell us about in depth at St. Joseph's Hospital. But now, because we're telling you you're going to jail, now you want to say that you don't remember anything and that this is all not real and that you hear voices. I don't buy it. I don't buy it, Jacob. I think you're looking for an excuse and you're looking for a way out, and you're not taking accountability for what you did to your daughter. That's what's so sad about it, is that you're not taking accountability for your actions. This little girl depended on you.
She never learned to walk. She never said her first word. She never had a birthday. She was 4 months old. 4 months of breathing, of blinking, of reaching for light with tiny fingers that did not yet understand the world. Her family called her Strawberry. Not because of anything in particular, just the kind of nickname that sticks when a baby arrives and everyone around her overflows with love and cannot help themselves. Strawberry, sweet, small, precious. On the morning that would become the worst morning of her short life, Strawberry was in the care of a 22-year-old man named Jacob Kubai. He was supposed to protect her. Instead, when paramedics arrived, Strawberry was gone, and the injuries they found on her tiny body told a story that no one in that room wanted to believe. More than 10 broken ribs, hemorrhaging along her spine, blunt force trauma to both the front and the back of her skull. This was not an accident. This was not a fall. This was violence. Deliberate, repeated, directed at a 4-month-old child who could not run, could not fight, could not scream loud enough for anyone to hear. What followed was a police interrogation that would lay bare not just what Jacob Kubai did, but who he was when the pressure finally found him. This is the story of Strawberry and the man who took her from this world. Polk County, Florida sits in the center of the state. It is not a glamorous place. It is not the kind of county that makes the news for its beaches or its theme parks. It is working class and quiet and sprawling, a place where people live ordinary lives between long days at work and evenings at home. In that county, in a home that looked like every other home on the street, there was a baby named Strawberry, 4 months old. Still at that stage where sleep and waking blurred together, where hunger is the most urgent feeling in the world, where the face of a caregiver is the only map a child has for understanding whether the universe is safe. She had no way of knowing that the man watching over her that day was not safe. No one had told her. No one could have. Jacob Kubai was 22 years old. By all outward appearances, he was just a young man navigating early adulthood. He had a relationship. He had a child. He had responsibilities the way young adults do when life arrives faster than they expected. On the surface, nothing seemed wrong. The day started the way most days start. Routines, movement, the ordinary texture of life before catastrophe. Strawberry was alive that morning. She was alive and small and helpless the way 4-month-old babies are. By the time anyone understood what had happened inside that house, she would not be. And Jacob Kubai would have a story ready. He always had a story. That was the first thing investigators noticed about him. Not panic, not grief, not the stunned silence of someone who had just watched a child die. Jacob Kubai had a story, and the story from the very beginning did not hold up. When a child dies, suddenly investigators have one immediate priority. They need to know what happened in the hours before, not the days, not the weeks, the hours. Because in cases like Strawberry's, the window of injury is narrow. The human body, even a small one, gives forensic examiners a timeline. And that timeline points directly at whoever was present. Jacob Kubai was present. He was the primary caregiver that day. He was alone with Strawberry for a significant portion of the time leading up to her collapse. That made him the most important person in the room when detectives sat down to ask their questions. And Jacob had an answer ready. He told investigators he had taken Strawberry to Walmart. It was a simple, verifiable claim, innocent sounding, the kind of thing a young father might genuinely say. I took her to the store. We were out. She was with me the whole time. Investigators did not take his word for it. That is what investigators do. They verify, they pull footage, they check timestamps, they cross-reference what people say with what the evidence shows. The Walmart security camera footage told a different story. Jacob Kubai appeared on that footage. Strawberry did not. He walked into that store alone. He walked out alone. There was no infant carrier. There was no baby. There was no Strawberry. He had left her somewhere, or something had already happened to her before he ever left the house. That single discrepancy, a lie so easily disproven, told detectives everything they needed to know about how this interrogation was going to go. Jacob Kubai was not telling the truth. And the question was no longer whether he was involved. The question was how far he was willing to go to avoid saying what he had done. The medical examiner's report is not a document for the faint of heart. It is written in clinical language. Measurements, angles, depths. The terminology of forensic science, precise and cold, designed to describe injury without emotion. But behind every line of that report was a 4-month-old child. And what the report described was catastrophic. Strawberry had more than 10 broken ribs. 10. To understand what that means for an infant, you have to understand that a 4-month-old's ribs are still developing. They are softer and more flexible than adult ribs, which is why pediatric pathologists take rib fractures in infants extremely seriously. It takes significant repeated force to break them. It does not happen from a single fall. It does not happen from an accidental drop. It happens when someone applies force to a child's body over and over with enough pressure to crack bone. But the rib fractures were only part of what the examiner found. Strawberry had hemorrhaging along her spine, bleeding around the spinal cord caused by trauma to that region of her body. The kind of injury that signals violent shaking or forceful impact to the back. And then there was the skull. Blunt force trauma. Both sides, the front and the back of her skull, had been struck, or had struck something. The distinction matters forensically, but the conclusion is the same. Her head had experienced violent impact, twice, from different directions. The examiners were unambiguous in their findings. These injuries were not consistent with any accident. They were consistent with child abuse. Repeated, sustained, deliberate physical violence directed at an infant who could not protect herself. Strawberry did not die from a medical condition. She was killed. And now the detectives who held that report in their hands had to walk into a room with Jacob Kubai and get him to admit it. There is a pattern that emerges in cases like this. The violence happens, and then comes the cover. Not always a sophisticated cover. Not always a plan. Sometimes it is just instinct, the animal reflex of someone who has done something they know is wrong, scrambling for any exit they can find. Jacob Kubai's movements in the immediate aftermath are telling. He left the house. He went to Walmart without the baby he claimed to have with him. He moved through that store past other shoppers, past the cameras he did not realize were recording with Strawberry left behind. When investigators pieced together the timeline, the gaps were damning. The window between when Strawberry was last seen alive by anyone other than Jacob and when she was found unresponsive pointed to him clearly and unmistakably. There was no one else. There was no mysterious intruder. There was no unexplained visitor. There was no alternative suspect who could have walked into that home, done what was done to that child, and disappeared without a trace. The evidence chain was short, and it led directly to Jacob Kubai. Security footage, witness accounts, the medical examiner's timeline. All of it converged on one man, one window of time, one residence. When investigators finally brought Jacob in for questioning, they already knew more than he realized. They knew about the Walmart footage. They knew about the injuries. They knew the timeline. What they needed from Jacob was not information. What they needed was a confession. And getting that confession would require patience, strategy, and the ability to sit across from a man and watch him construct lie after lie until the structure finally collapsed. That interrogation is where this story gets complicated. Interrogation rooms are designed to be uncomfortable, not in an obvious way. No rubber hoses, no bright lights pointed at sweating foreheads. That is the Hollywood version. The real version is subtler. Small spaces, hard chairs, a table between the detective and the suspect that is close enough to feel intimate and far enough to feel formal. Cameras in corners recording everything. Mirrors that may or may not be two-way glass. The message is ambient. You are not in control here. We are. When Jacob Kubai sat down in that room, the detectives knew what they were walking into. They had dealt with difficult suspects before. People who lie, people who deflect, people who cry, people who rage, people who go silent. Jacob would present a different challenge. At first, he was cooperative in a surface-level way, answering questions, offering details, performing the role of a worried young man caught up in a tragedy he did not cause. He talked about Strawberry with what sounded on the surface like concern. The detectives let him talk. That is strategy. When a suspect is talking, they are also revealing. Every lie told creates another lie that needs to be supported. Every false detail creates a thread that, when pulled, begins to unravel the whole fabric of the story. The detectives pulled threads. They brought up Walmart. They watched Jacob's face. They laid the security footage in front of him, not aggressively, but calmly, the way you present a fact to someone, and give them a moment to reckon with it. Jacob did not collapse. He pivoted. He adjusted his story. He explained. He had another version, a slightly different account that tried to accommodate the evidence without conceding the central point. The detectives did not react with frustration. They noted the adjustment, and they kept going. Because somewhere behind all the pivots and the adjustments, there was a truth that Jacob Kubai was working very hard to keep buried. And they were not done digging. Every interrogation has a turning point. Sometimes it is a piece of evidence dropped on the table. Sometimes it is a specific question, phrased in a specific way that cuts through the noise and lands somewhere the suspect did not expect. For Jacob Kubai, the turning point came gradually. The detectives methodically dismantled his accounts. The Walmart story was gone. Other explanations he offered for the timeline for his whereabouts, for the sequence of events, were met with contradicting evidence calmly presented. Jacob began to understand that the room was closing around him. And then he asked for a lawyer. That is his right. It is every suspect's right. The moment those words are spoken, a proper interrogation must stop. The detectives acknowledged the request. Jacob was handcuffed, and something changed. The moment the handcuffs went on, something shifted in Jacob Kubai. Whether it was the physical reality of restraint, the sudden concrete understanding that he was no longer a person sitting in a room answering questions, but a person in custody, the calculus changed for him. He reversed course. He said he wanted to talk, not through his lawyer, not after a consultation. He wanted to talk now in that room with the handcuffs on and the cameras rolling. What came next was unexpected. Jacob Kubai began to tell a different kind of story. He said he heard voices. Strange voices, he described them. Voices that told him to do things. Voices that pushed him toward violence. He said he had doubts about his own reality, that he was not sure he had ever been married, that he was not sure he had ever had a child. He spoke about the baby, about Strawberry, as though she existed at a remove from him, as though she were a concept, not a person he had held and fed and been alone with on the day she died. The detectives listened. They did not interrupt. They let Jacob build his new story, the one about the voices, the one about the confusion, the one that if anyone believed it might raise questions about his mental state and his culpability. But when he was finished, the detectives responded in a way that was direct and deliberate. They did not believe him. They told him so, not cruelly, not with contempt, but with the flat clarity of people who have spent careers learning the difference between genuine psychiatric disturbance and a calculated performance. Jacob's story, they concluded, was the latter. The voices arrived too conveniently. The confusion about his own marriage and his own child emerged at exactly the moment when the evidence against him was at its most damning. The timeline of his sudden uncertainty mapped perfectly onto the timeline of his legal jeopardy. The detectives had seen this before. Not often, but they had seen it. A person who has committed an act they know is indefensible, who has run out of alternative explanations, who arrives at the last door available to them, the door marked mental illness, and walks through it hoping no one notices the pivot. Jacob noticed them noticing, and still he kept going, because at that point, he had nothing left to lose by trying. While the interrogation played out in that small room, investigators were working on every other front simultaneously. This is how it works in cases like Strawberry's. The interview is one thread. The forensic investigation is another. The witness canvas is a third. All of them run in parallel, and when the results come back, they are laid against each other to see where they align and where they contradict. In Jacob Kubai's case, the results aligned with remarkable consistency. The security footage from Walmart placed him at the store without the baby at a time he claimed she was with him. The medical examiner's findings established a timeline of injury that was consistent with the window during which Jacob was the primary caregiver. Forensic analysis of the home and of Strawberry's body found nothing that supported an alternative explanation for her injuries. No evidence of a fall from height. No evidence of a medical condition that could cause those specific injuries. No evidence of anyone else in the home. The physical evidence, the digital evidence, and the witness accounts all told the same story. One person had access to Strawberry during the time her injuries were sustained. One person had lied about where she was. One person was now sitting in an interrogation room, cycling through stories from innocent bystander to Walmart companion to man who heard strange voices to a person who denied the existence of his own child. Investigators also looked at Jacob's history. Context matters in cases like this. Not to excuse anything, but to understand the full picture of who someone is, how they behave under stress, whether there are patterns that make the events of a given day less surprising. What they found informed their understanding of Jacob Kubai without changing the conclusion the evidence had already reached. He had done this. The evidence was overwhelming. All that remained was the legal process that would translate that evidence into consequences. Jacob Kubai was charged in connection with the death of his 4-month-old daughter. The charges reflected what the evidence showed. Not a moment of rage followed by remorse. Not a single terrible instant that ended in tragedy. The number and nature of Strawberry's injuries, more than 10 broken ribs, spinal hemorrhaging, bilateral skull trauma, pointed to something more sustained than a single act. They pointed to a pattern of violence against a child who could not defend herself. The legal proceedings moved forward. Prosecutors presented the medical examiner's findings. They presented the Walmart footage. They presented the timeline reconstructed with forensic precision that placed Jacob alone with Strawberry during the period in which her fatal injuries were sustained. The defense attempted to raise questions about Jacob's mental state. Those claims were evaluated. That is what the legal system does. When a defendant raises the question of mental illness, courts and mental health professionals examine the claim. They look at behavior before, during, and after the incident. They look at consistency. They look at whether the symptoms appear only in the context of legal jeopardy or whether they reflect a genuine documented condition. The evaluation of Jacob Kubai did not support the claims he had made in the interrogation room. The voices he described, the uncertainty about his own identity, the dissociation from the fact of his own marriage and fatherhood, were not corroborated by his history, his behavior before the incident, or the professional assessments conducted afterward. The jury heard the evidence. They returned a verdict. Guilty. Jacob Kubai was sentenced to 30 years in prison. 30 years for 30 years that Strawberry would never have. She did not get to say her first word. She did not get to take her first step. She did not get to grow up and find out who she was going to be. He will serve 3 decades before he is eligible to see the outside of a prison wall. And when that day comes, Strawberry will still be 4 months old. She will always be 4 months old. The interrogation of Jacob Kubai is worth examining carefully. Not because it is entertaining, not because it is satisfying to watch the walls close in on a guilty person, but because it is instructive. Because understanding what happened in that room tells us something important about how people behave when they are cornered by the truth. Jacob moved through a recognizable sequence. Stage 1 was denial. This is almost universal. The suspect presents an alternative account, positions themselves as cooperative works to establish a plausible alternative explanation for the evidence. For Jacob, this was the Walmart story. The baby was with him. He was out. Everything was fine. The death was unexpected. He had no idea what had happened to her. This held until it did not. The moment the Walmart footage was introduced, denial became untenable. A specific verifiable lie had been exposed. Jacob could not maintain that version of events without directly contradicting documented evidence. Stage 2 was adjustment. The story shifted. New details were introduced. The account mutated to accommodate the evidence the way water flows around a rock rather than stopping at it. Investigators see this constantly. It is not a sign of guilt on its own. Innocent people also adjust their accounts when challenged because memory is imperfect and details blur. But the nature of the adjustments matters. When adjustments consistently move away from the evidence rather than toward it, when each new version of events creates more distance from accountability rather than less, that pattern is meaningful. Jacob's adjustments move consistently in one direction, away from responsibility. Stage 3 was escalation. This is less common. When denial and adjustment both fail, some suspects escalate to claims that reframe the entire conversation. Jacob's escalation was the claim of mental disturbance. The voices, the confusion about his own identity, the dissociation from his own history as a husband and a father. This move is not unintelligent on its face. Mental illness is a legitimate legal defense in appropriate circumstances. If someone genuinely lacks the capacity to understand the nature of their actions, the legal system has mechanisms to address that. But the timing of Jacob's claims was notable. They emerged not at the beginning of the interrogation when he first sat down in that room. They did not appear in the initial stages of questioning. They arrived specifically at the moment when he was in handcuffs, when the evidence had been laid out, when every other available route had closed off. The detectives observed this. They had a framework for understanding it. Genuine psychiatric breaks do not follow the logical arc of legal jeopardy. A person in the grip of a genuine dissociative episode or a genuine psychotic break does not calibrate the timing of their symptoms to the moment when the evidence against them reaches its peak. Jacob's confusion about whether he had ever been married, whether he had ever had a child, arrived at exactly the moment when admitting to having had a child would have connected him irrevocably to that child's death. The detectives saw it, they named it, and they moved through it. What the interrogation ultimately revealed was a young man who had committed an act of violence against a defenseless infant and who, when confronted with the evidence, cycled through every available strategy to avoid accountability. Denial, misdirection, false verification, and finally, when all else failed, a performance of mental illness that the investigators and ultimately the court did not find credible. None of it worked. But it tells us something worth sitting with. It tells us that in the aftermath of violence against a child, the perpetrator's primary concern was not for the child, not for Strawberry. It was for himself. This part is just for her, not for Jacob, not for the interrogation, not for the evidence or the timeline or the legal proceedings, just for Strawberry. She was 4 months old when she died, which means she had been alive for roughly 120 days. In 120 days, she had learned to recognize faces. Research tells us that infants at 4 months can distinguish between familiar faces and strangers. They respond to the people who care for them. They smile when they are happy. They cry when they are frightened or in pain. She could smile. She had smiled. Somewhere in those 4 months, there had been moments of genuine joy for her. A warm bath, a soft voice, being held against a chest and hearing a heartbeat. Babies find comfort in those things. Science has documented it. But anyone who has held an infant already knows it intuitively. She was developing at 4 months. Her brain was building connections at a rate that would never happen again in her entire life. Every sight, every sound, every touch was being processed and filed and used to construct an understanding of the world. She was growing into a person. She had preferences she was just beginning to discover. There were probably sounds she liked and sounds that startled her. There were probably positions she preferred when she slept. There was probably a face, a specific face, that made her feel safer than any other. We do not know all the details of her personality because she did not have enough time to show us. That is the particular cruelty of infant homicide. The victim cannot testify. The victim cannot tell us who they were. The victim cannot advocate for themselves in any room, legal or otherwise. Strawberry exists in the record primarily through the findings of a medical examiner. That is not who she was. She was a baby. She was someone's daughter. She was someone's granddaughter. She was surrounded by people who called her by a nickname that overflows with sweetness because that is what she was to them. Sweet, small, irreplaceable. The people who loved her will carry this for the rest of their lives. They will think about her on what would have been her birthdays. We will see children her age and then older children who grew into the ages she never reached, and they will feel the specific grief of the years she was not allowed to have. There is no version of this story in which justice feels adequate. 30 years is 30 years. It is real. It is not nothing. But Strawberry is still gone, and she deserves so much more than 120 days. Cases like Strawberry's are not anomalies. That is the uncomfortable truth. Child abuse is not a rare deviation in an otherwise functional system. It is a persistent, documented, widespread problem that exists across economic classes, across geographic regions, across family structures. Infants are disproportionately vulnerable, not because abusers specifically target infants, though that sometimes happens, but because infants are completely dependent. They cannot report abuse. They cannot remove themselves from dangerous situations. They cannot call for help. They exist entirely at the mercy of whoever is responsible for their care. When that person is safe, the infant is safe. When that person is not, the infant has no recourse. The Strawberry case highlights several specific areas where systems can and should function better. The first is caregiver screening and support. Young parents, particularly young fathers, are often undertreated in social service systems. The assumption is frequently that the mother is the primary caregiver and the father is a supporting presence. In reality, caregiving arrangements vary enormously. Young fathers who are primary caregivers need access to the same support networks, the same parenting resources, the same crisis interventions as young mothers. Isolation is a risk factor. When a young caregiver is alone with an infant for extended periods, without adequate support, without community connections, without access to someone they can call, When they are overwhelmed, the pressure that builds can have catastrophic consequences. The second area is recognizing the warning signs. Unexplained injuries in infants should never be treated as routine or accepted without thorough investigation. Pediatric medical providers are trained to recognize injury patterns consistent with abuse. That training matters and saves lives. But the system only works when injuries are reported, when providers ask the hard questions, when social services follow through on referrals. Every link in that chain has to hold. The third area is community accountability. We tend to treat child abuse as a private matter, a family matter, something that happens behind closed doors and is not our business. That framing costs lives. When neighbors hear something and do not call, when family members notice something and tell themselves it is not their place, when the instinct to avoid conflict or preserve relationships takes precedence over the safety of a child who cannot protect herself. Strawberry was in a home surrounded by a community. That community could not see through the walls. But communities that stay engaged, that check on each other, that take seriously the welfare of the children around them, are communities that catch these situations before they become tragedies. It is not about surveillance. It is about care. The kind of care that Strawberry deserved and did not receive. Jacob Kubai is 30 years into the life he will live inside a prison. He is there because a jury heard the evidence and reached the only conclusion the evidence supported. He is there because a team of investigators refused to accept his lies one after another until the truth was the only thing left standing in that room. He is there because the system, imperfect as it is, eventually worked. But Strawberry is not here. That is the part that does not resolve. The legal system can assign consequences. It can put a person in a cell and leave them there for decades. It can read a verdict aloud in a courtroom and fill out the paperwork and close the case file. What it cannot do is bring her back. It cannot give her the first word, the first step, the first birthday with a tiny cupcake and people singing and everyone leaning close to see if she will try to blow out the candle. It cannot give her the first day of school or the summer afternoons or the years of ordinary life that are the most valuable thing a human being has and the thing we least appreciate until it is gone. 4 months. Think about what 4 months is in the context of a life, in the context of your life. 4 months is a season. 4 months is a job you held briefly. 4 months is the time between one ordinary Tuesday and another. For Strawberry, 4 months was everything, and someone took even that from her. There is a question worth sitting with after a case like this. Not a question about Jacob Kubai because his story has been told and his consequences have been handed down. A question about the next Strawberry because she is out there. Not a specific child we can name. But statistically, certainly there is an infant somewhere in this country who is in the care of someone who should not be trusted with her, who is in a home where the pressure has built past a breaking point, who has no way to tell anyone that she is not safe. The question is whether there is anyone around that child who will pay attention, whether the neighbor will trust their instincts, whether the family member will make the call, whether the medical provider will ask the question they have been trained to ask, whether the system will hold together long enough to get to that child before the ending is written. Strawberry did not have that. The next one might. If we decide that her life meant something, if we decide that her story is not just something to watch and then leave behind, if we carry something from this, some small resolve to pay closer attention to the children around us, to take the question of their safety seriously, even when it is inconvenient or awkward or uncomfortable. That is what Strawberry deserves. Not just 30 years in a courtroom record, an actual legacy, a world that is in some small way safer for the next 4-month-old who cannot protect herself. Her name was Strawberry. Remember her.